Hello, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. Today, I get to talk with scholar and writer Esau McCaulley. And as you'll hear, Esau is a fascinating man. He grew up in Alabama. He's a black man who landed after a circuitous journey as a professor at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. And he's recently written a terrific book called Reading While Black. We'll talk a lot about the book. It came out last week. And it's about what the Black church has to offer the church in America more broadly. I really appreciated this book. I really appreciated our conversation. And I think I loved it so much because he tackles all the hard stuff: racism, brutality, division, rage. And he does all of that under this banner of hope in a God of faithfulness and a God who has been faithful and will be faithful through all generations. So you're in for a treat, and I think you will join me in gratitude for what Esau McCaulley has to offer us all today. My guest today is New Testament scholar Esau McCaulley, who is also the author of the very recently released book, Reading While Black, African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. And we're going to really be focused on that book today because it just came out and because I really highly recommend people digging into it as soon as possible. So welcome, Esau. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
So I have been reading and appreciating your essays in the New York Times for a while now. You've been writing opinion pieces for them. And it was really a treat to get to read more of your work in Reading While Black. And one of the things I want to say to any listeners who are interested in the book is that it is a scholarly work, but it's also a personal one. It's very accessible and readable. It is less than 200 pages, but the amount that you cover in those less than 200 pages is phenomenal. You've got history, you've got theology. I know you're a New Testament scholar, and we get New Testament, but we also get a lot of other things. I was an African American studies minor in college, and so I took an African American religion course, actually with Al Rabito, who you quote a couple times and reference in the book. And I've done a lot of reading and thinking in these spaces, but I thought you did a wonderful job of both introducing, but not in a surface way, a lot of different topics and bringing it very much into the present debates that are surrounding race in America, Christianity in America. So well done. Excellent job. So one of the things
that's high praise. That's a lot for me to process. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for writing it. One of the things, though, that I really loved was that there is this interplay between your own story as a Black man growing up in America and in the South specifically. You don't live there anymore, but that's where you started. And then history and scholarship. But I wanted to just start with your story because if I'm reading it correctly, grew up in Alabama and you were like a decent student, but not a like highly motivated, I'm going to go on and become a scholar student. And so I want to know how you ended up as a college professor who studies the New Testament and teaches about it and studied with Tom Wright and on and on and on. So I want to know that trajectory. How did you get from like football in Alabama to the college professorship you hold now?
That would be the whole podcast if I told the story.
All right,
so
in brief.
An encouragement. Yeah, this might be an encouragement, at least to the people who don't think that they're academically inclined. So I was never in the top 20 in my class in high school. You know, I was just a regular student. I mean, I was decent. I was like a B plus student.
Okay.
But I didn't need to be a good student because to be honest, I was a good athlete and I had put a lot of my hope in just doing well enough to be able to qualify to get a college scholarship. That was my like intellectual goal. And so I'll skip huge portions of the story.
Okay.
After I got hurt my junior year in high school, that academic career was threatened. Mm-hmm. And so I had to say, I really need to like buckle down and get my GPA up so I can get into a school in case I don't get a scholarship. And so my senior year in high school, I got straight A's for the first time in my life. Huh. But then I got into college and there was some kind of discussion as to whether or not they would let me in because my grades weren't amazing. And where I went to undergrad, Swanee was a technical school. And so, I mean, a difficult school to get into at the time. I guess it still is. And so when I got to Swanee, I performed really well. and it was kind of like a success story, like the Black kid from the inner city
Huh.
goes to the white college and succeeds.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of it, and it was there that at 20 that I began to flourish a little bit academically. I was never an amazing student, maybe from like a 3.0 in high school to like a 3.5 in college, and then wasn't in the top 20 or anything there. But I fell in love with, as you talked about, history and biblical studies, which you can kind of hear I won't retell the story of the book. So then I went to seminary at Gordon Conwell. And there I did, once again, I did pretty well. I was kind of like maybe an A- student. But once again, nothing to write home about. I was not a valedictorian or any of those things. Nobody
Right.
looked at me and said, "You're amazing." So then I got married. And I'll tell you the real story, Amy. People
Oh,
don't ask
good.
this. You get the real story. So I got married to this wonderful lady, and she said she wanted to be a missionary overseas. And because I have particular opinions as to what we should do if we do global missions,
Yeah.
I didn't want to go and be a pastor there because I thought the indigenous people can lead their congregations better.
Great.
And so I said, I'll just get a PhD so I can then train people overseas.
Yeah.
And so I went to a second school to do my graduate degree. And I was just going to apply to kind of any school that would take me for free. And so I can have low debt and then begin to do some graduate studies. And one of my professors said to me, he said, Esau, you can't just apply to like Podunk University and get your PhD. You should really challenge yourself. I said, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to be a missionary. They'll take, like, this is me being like, American, snobbery, a PhD from anywhere would be fine. And he said, well, if you could go anywhere in the world to study, where would you go? And I said, and the books were in front of me on the other side of the room. Oh, I'd go to wherever N.T. Wright is teaching.
Yeah.
And so he said, well, why don't you apply? And so I applied to the University of St. Andrews, and they accepted me. And then I found myself moving to Scotland to study for PhD. And so during that time, me and my wife discerned that we weren't going to be called to a missionary career. And she said, well, can you try to find a job somewhere in America? And so I found a job in a school in Rochester, New York. And then from there, I came to Wheaton. So I never, ever, 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 ever imagined, even as late as 2015, that I would ever be teaching in an American university. And if you had told me I'd be writing my second book at this point, I also wouldn't have imagined that either.
Right.
Or writing in the New York Times. None of this stuff was planned.
Right. And to go from Alabama to Wheaton by way of Scotland was not what you had anticipated.
Alabama, I skipped a portion of it. We were in Japan at the time.
Oh my goodness.
So my wife was in the Navy. And so we were living in Japan, and I was flying back to the United States to finish my second master's degree. And then we went to Florida for like 8 to 10 months while she finished up her military commitment. And then it was Japan. So it's like Japan by way of Florida, by way of Scotland, by way of New York, by way of Wheaton. If you want to get the whole story correct.
Well, I love it. And I did want to just start there because I think that's so fascinating. And I do think it's really encouraging, actually, as a reminder that our destinies are not fixed, right? And that our GPA in high school does not determine not just our intellectual ability, but our ability to contribute to conversation and to learning and to what other people, have to gain from what we've learned. So thanks for sharing that with us.
And really at the heart of it is that like the things that I was forced to study were the things that weren't for me. And I just wasn't interested in them.
Going back to high school, you mean?
Yeah, I cared about like what was happening in my community.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of the stuff that I was reading and writing was seen irrelevant. And I'm the kind of person where if it doesn't seem relevant, then I kind of check out.
Yeah.
And so the further I went along in education, the more focused I was able to become on doing what I actually wanted to do. And so by the time I got to the place where I could do what I actually wanted to do, I thrived. And that even extends beyond like into graduate school. So I'm very proud of my first book. So I don't want to but it's a book that I had to write to get a PhD.
Okay. Right.
So in that sense, I was having to follow somebody else's rules.
Mm-hmm.
Reading While Black was mine, and where I felt like I could finally be myself as a writer, and all of the kind of the rules that were put in place that weren't designed for people like me were gone, and I could just write what I wanted to write.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you wrote it. And actually, I'd love to start with, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a history book, but you, in one significant portion of the book, provide historical reasons to understand Christianity and even the nation of Israel, the Israelites in the Old Testament, as including people who we now would call Black, right? Like North Africans, and a much more multi-ethnic vision of the Jewish people as well as early Christians than I think, at least in the American church, is like our common perception. Can you just walk us through some of that history and the reasons why it actually matters that we literally envision multi-ethnic communities as the basis and foundation of the church and the faith more broadly?
Yes, the first thing I would say is, like, I'm not the first person to do this. It's just interesting that how this information doesn't kind of permeate the public consciousness. There was a generation of African American exegetes before me, and I mentioned them, and I think the bonus track chapter, how like some of the people who've done it beforehand. Well, I told the story of Ephraim and Manasseh at the beginning of the book of Genesis, and those are the two sons of Joseph. But Joseph's has a wife who's Egyptian. And
Yeah.
so at the end of Jacob's life, Joseph brings these two brothers, his two sons, to bless for Jacob to bless him. And what happens there is that Jacob looks at these boys and he remembers. He says, "Listen, I remember when God appeared to me and he said, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. I'm going to make you a company of peoples, different ethnic groups." And he saw in the multi-ethnicity of these two boys a fulfillment of God's promise to make the people of Israel into many nations. And so he says, for that reason, he took these two half Egyptian boys and made them a part of his own, two of the 10 tribes. And
Yeah.
so the Bible says very clearly, it's not fancy exegesis, it's not in Greek, it's not in Hebrew. It says that two of the 12 tribes were founded by half Egyptian, half Jewish boys.
Right.
So from the beginning, Israel was this multi-ethnic community.
Yeah.
I also talk about how it makes the statement when the Israelites leave Egypt. It says that a company of people, after the plagues, a company of peoples leave with them. And so the story of Exodus makes it clear that it's not just Israelites that leave to go to the promised land. It's other ethnic groups from the area who also found themselves in Egypt. And so what I wanted to say is that from the beginning, as far back in the Bible as you want to go, you have people who are Black and brown. And this is the thing that I try to point out in this book is the hypocrisy of how we define race in America. Because the segregation laws in the South state that if you have one drop of blood, one drop of Black blood, you are Black. And so if you are 1/64th Black, you are Black. And so then the question is, if you then take that, and they actually had, and I didn't get into all of this in the book, they had these cases where people of different ethnic descent came to the United States and actually sued the Supreme Court.
Right.
I think there was an Indian man who sued the Supreme Court to be classified as white so that he would be subject to discrimination. And they say, no, you don't kind of meet that category. Yeah. So according to the laws in America, all of those people would have been subject to discrimination. Absolutely. Because they would have had like some African blood in them. So then when you come to the Bible, we have a higher standard for what counts as Blackness. Like only the Nubians count when we think about conceptualizing who is African in the Bible. And so I said, well, you can't have one set of standards used to discriminate against people and another set of standards that are used to kind of courting Blackness off. Because in that case, then what you do is you make everybody in the Bible white because the standards of a character being Black or brown is so high. And then in the actual lived experience of the people at the time, then any drop of Black blood brought about persecution. And so I talked about like how if we're going to go by, and I'm not saying the American standards are the correct ones, but if we're going to function by them, let's be consistent and apply it to the world of the biblical era, and in the sense of conceptualizing it. Yeah. And then I go on to talk about in the New Testament, where in the exact same way you see Black people at the African people is what I like to say. Yeah. African people, the origins of the Israelite story. You also see African peoples at the origin of the Christian story with the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch and Simon of Cyrene, who carries Jesus' cross.
Right.
So at the origin of both of the covenants in the Christian scriptures and the Jewish and the Christian scriptures, you see African peoples there. So it's not this case where we're trying to find ourselves in a story in which we're largely absent and we're looking for crumbs, but you can't tell the story of Christianity or Judaism without Africa.
Well, and it's interesting. I think I remember seeing a depiction, like a medieval artistic depiction of Adam and Eve as two very Northern European figures, and thinking about it in terms of whether I'm going back to like evolutionary biology and human origins or the biblical story of literally in the physical world where Adam and Eve would have started, and being like, they wouldn't have looked like Northern Europeans. I don't know exactly what they would have looked like, but my imagination has been so shaped by this like Western art tradition, whether it comes to Adam and Eve, to Jesus himself, where, I mean, we've talked, certainly many people in recent years, about the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Jesus and the problem there. And I've read a couple of novels recently, one by James McBride called Deacon King Kong, where there's a black Jesus in the church. And there's this sense of, why does my imagination get shocked by the concept of a black or brown Jesus, of a black or brown Adam and Eve? And it's been shaped and formed by Northern European, Western art and conceptions of whiteness. And it's really good to disrupt that so that I can envision the kingdom of God more broadly. What you're doing is bringing in, this is not just imagination. This is actually like physiological reality that the early church and the early Israelite community was not monolithic, was not homogenous. And I think that's really important in terms of understanding our identity as the church and as Christians, and kind of who the family of God really includes.
Yeah, one of the things that we try to do is we think that, well, as long as we get our doctrine correct, if we say the things about justification, or we say whatever we think these central Christian ideas are, then like diversity, ethnic diversity, is kind of an optional extra. It's like, do you want the ice cream after your full meal? But if you do something like read Paul's letter to the Ephesians, Paul says this, and he says it, and once again, you don't need to know Greek or anything else. He talks about the mystery that was hidden before all ages.
Yes.
And the mystery, and I want to make sure I'm clear about this. The first part, Paul lauds our salvation by grace apart from anything that we do. He does all of that. When he says, you know what the plot twist in the Bible is? This thing that nobody saw coming, this thing that is amazing. He said the Gentiles are fellow heirs with the Jews to the promises. So the thing that you get when you go like, Paul, and this is the mystery of which Paul sees himself as a steward, something he has to oversee. So what's the plot twist in the Bible that Paul didn't see coming? Jews and Gentiles were together as one people. And so Paul thinks that there's something about our togetherness as the people of God across difference that testifies to something about the nature of the kingdom that is inextricably lost. Like God said, we believe that God, some people could say God commissioned Paul as the apostle of justification by grace. But no, he said, you're the apostle to the Gentiles.
Right.
Because it is vital to the future of what I want to do in the world for people to see the nations gathered to me. And we begin to see what drove Paul is spreading the gospel to the Gentiles, to the different peoples of the world, as being an optional extra. And you don't even actually have to live together as long as we have the correct doctrine in communities that are far apart. And there's something about us together that I think is lost. And what I tried to say is that that's not just something that Paul concocts. It's something that you see as far back into the Bible as you want to go.
I know. I love that. And I think it's really, really helpful and important. I'm also struck by, going back though all the way to Egypt, you wrote, God did not choose the Egyptians, he chose the enslaved. And I want to hear more about how the story of the Exodus out of Egypt, this ongoing identification of both God and later Jesus with the enslaved Israelites, how that's like shaped the theological understanding of the Black church in America, and why that matters for all Christians. Because on the one hand, God is for all people, and yet there is this willingness and insistence on identifying with the poor and the oppressed, and in this case, in the enslaved, which I think especially for Americans even American Christians who live in material prosperity and relative lack of suffering and want, I think we can miss that and miss the significance of it. So I'm just wondering if you could say more about that.
Yeah, I think that you're paraphrasing my quotation to James Cone. James Cone wasn't the first person to say it, but this is where it comes from. He said that if God had chosen the Egyptians as his chosen people, that a different kind of God would have been revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a long tradition of African American identification with kind of the Israelite story. And I think that what it does is that the African American Christian tradition, because we initially received kind of a distorted gospel that God wants you to be content with your circumstances, and that the message of the Bible is slaves submit to your masters, and maybe your body and your soul will be free in the coming kingdom. And that was rooted in kind of things like 1 Timothy chapter 6. And what the African American Christians did as a whole, they said, well, hold on. There's this whole story in the Bible of God liberating like an entire people who were enslaved.
Right.
And they say, well, this is kind of like, this is what God, this goes to the front of God's resume. He says it over and over and over again. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And so for the African American Christian or the African American looking to the Bible to say, well, what kind of God is revealed there? And then if you kind of go beyond that to say, well, how does God then describe himself in things like the Psalms and the prophets? He's the defender of orphans and widows. And when the state and the powers that be don't care about them, the people have to turn to God. And there's this strong confidence that God will liberate them.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're an oppressed people and you're asking the question, well, does God side with me or does God side with the people who are abusing me? Well, any viable reading of the Bible is going to say that God sides with the people who are oppressed. Now, the way that can kind of get lost is that we can separate that from what the rest of the story says. And the image that I like to use is that in the Bible, the Exodus story gives way to Leviticus. So you have the liberation of the people. Then you have the formation of the rituals and the practices that form them into the holy people of God. And so the telos of liberation in the Bible isn't just for you to be free to order your own socio-political realities, although that's part of it. The end goal of liberation is freedom to worship the living God and be transformed by him. And historically, the African-American Christian tradition has kept both those things together. Now, and the reason we kept those things together is because our social location, the things that we experience, sent us to the Bible with a particular question. What does the Bible have to say, and what does God have to say about what is happening to us? Now, if you kind of pan over and look at the white church at this time, there's a different set of priorities. There's the political, economic, and basically material benefit of keeping people oppressed. And so they're not going to the Bible asking, well, what does the Bible have to say about the weakest of these? They're as a whole going to the Bible saying, well, how can I justify what I already do? And so they found in the biblical text, they weren't disinterested exegetes. Their social location as the dominant people were distorted their reading of the Bible. And so what I try to say is that sometimes your position can either help or hinder your Bible reading. And if you're going to the Bible with a material benefit from oppression, it's sometimes harder to see all of these passages. Because here's the thing, nobody who reads the Bible now, I mean, I shouldn't say like 99% of the people who read the Bible now read the Bible the way that the enslaved did at the time. Right. And almost nobody still wants to hold the slave master exegesis. Right. Well, then, if it was so obvious, well, why couldn't the people see it at the time? Because their experiences were blinding them. And so what I want to say is that for the African-American Christian, we've always been able to look to the Bible and see, as it relates to the question of oppression and liberation, a God who willed our freedom and not our enslavement. And the last thing I'll say about this is that, like, I think implicitly, the slave masters knew it too, because they gave us an edited Bible. Right. By some accounts, there's a slave Bible with 60% of the Bible taken out of it. Now, if the Bible supports slavery from beginning to end, why do you take 60% out of it? That means they knew that they gave the whole thing to the people unfiltered. Then they had the possibility to kind of inspire in them a desire for freedom. So the very fact that they said, we have to edit this book, shows that they saw the book itself as dangerous. And it has been dangerous for us from the beginning. For us, like using it to claim who we were as people of God. Because things like Genesis 1:26 to 1:28, we're made in God's image come without an exception.
Right.
It's not like black people are like everybody except for black people are made in God's image.
Right.
And so those are the ways in which these texts have always, for us, or often for us, been a source of hope.
Well,
And that's what I tried to point to.
That's actually, yeah, I would love to go there to hope, because the subtitle of your book, which I love, African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope, can seem on first reading of the topics in your book, right? You're talking about policing, you're talking about racism, you're talking about rage, the rage experienced and felt by many African Americans on a daily basis. Those do not appear to be hopeful topics, right? Like we wouldn't say, oh, list all the reasons to hope, policing, racism, rage, but you make a case for why this is an exercise in hope. And I would love for you to talk about that and spell that out. Like, why is this hopeful and how do you understand it that way? Because I think that might bring a sense of why engaging the hardest stuff can actually be hopeful. I think people need to hear that.
Well, I'm glad that you said that. If we lived in a world where marketing, I came up with the title, so I'm happy with it. But the heart of the thesis of the book is African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. But if that was the title, none of you would buy it. So we had to have the first title and then the subtitle. And what I wanted to say is the hopefulness that emerges is not from the things that are happening themselves, right? That like policing, anger, those things aren't hopeful. They're depressing. But what I was saying is when Black people were faced with trauma, they can go to the God of the Bible and in him find the hope necessary to encounter those things. And so what I want to say is that the African American, let's kind of go back to kind of the invisible institution of slave churches. And so they deal with slavery and oppression. Well, then how do they find hope? They find hope through God. And so the practice of looking in these texts for an answer, the very practice of going to the Bible and asking God to meet us there is an exercise in hope. And so the only way that I use this in my in the book, in the article that I wrote for the New York Times. I think it's the first one that I wrote about the slaughter of the innocent children by Herod. And I said there is no other world in which into which Jesus can come. There's no other world other than the world in which babies are slaughtered. So the Christian gospel has to make its way there in a world that slaughters the innocent. There isn't like a world full of all happiness that Jesus just comes into and says, let's make things even better. Right. So when you talk about finding hope, the only place to find hope is in a place where it might not exist. And so what I tried to say in this book is here are the hardest things, not the only hard things, but here's some hard things we have to deal with as Christians. And how can the Bible be, into that context, a source of hope? One of the things I want people to understand is that when I wrote the titles of the chapters in a summary of what I wanted to talk about, but I had no idea what the answer was. So this is not a book that has, here are my 5 answers to the problems facing Black people. I wrote the topics down because I felt I couldn't write an honest book unless I addressed those things. And so the exercise in hope is not just for the reader. It was for me as I wrote it. And I say, like, I hope that God has something to say about slavery when I get there. I hope that God has something to say about Black rage when I get there. I hope that the Bible has something to say about policing when I get there. But I have to ask those questions because these are the questions that we are dealing with. And there's a way of, as a Christian, it's closing yourself off from those questions and trying to go through your whole life without really pressing into them and hoping that like it never jumps over the wall, the issues and the things that bother us. And I said, no, let's pull down all the walls. Let's let all the pain and the issues and the trauma come in and hope that God speaks into it a word of hope, because that's the only way I know how to be a Christian.
Yeah, and I wonder how much affluence and, again, an ability to protect ourselves, at least from physical experiences of suffering, builds those walls. Like reinforces what you were saying before of a slaveholder using the Bible to reinforce what I'm already doing rather than allowing it to be this prophetic and challenging word against my entire existence. So anyway, I mean, that's just what it makes me think of is like,
I think you're right. I think we have to be careful about motivated readings.
right.
So here let me give you an example. We talk about the fact that Black people have been historically oppressed in this country,
Mm-hmm.
and then we continue to experience injustice, maybe even at the hands of police.
Yeah.
So, what is at stake if we are correct? Like, if the African American Christians who've been saying this for years are correct, then implicitly, this America that we like to idealize has that's kind of a key pillar of kind of some of our worldviews is like we have to deeply receive that criticism and make sense of what it means to love this country on the other side of that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that it means is that like it's possible that people benefit from that. And the idea that like you might benefit from something that was bad
Mm-hmm.
causes people such a crisis that it's easier to explain away the problem than to face it. Because then if what we're saying is true, then things have to change. And if things have to change, then it means the world isn't going to be easy. If all you have to do is be individually nice to a Black person that you meet, then that's just stuff that you can incorporate into your life. But if there's actually systems in place that keep Black people down, we have to begin to think about, well, what kinds of things must I do to change that system? And so when I talk about like what motivated readings do, is that it potentially keeps us from answering the questions honestly because we're afraid about what it might mean as a result. I tell the story, and I'll be brief. I tell the story I think in this book about when the Pharisees come to Jesus and they're asking him questions. And he said, well, I'll answer your question if you explain to me about John's baptism.
Mm-hmm.
Was it from God or was it from man? And so they have a little committee meeting. And they said, well, if we say from God, then Jesus will say, why didn't you listen to him? And if we say from man, then the people are going to riot because they thought that John was a prophet. And so they said, we don't know. The important part about that, though, is that the people who were having their little committee meeting weren't concerned with the truth. They were concerned with the implications of the answer. And once you begin to say, I'm concerned with the implications of the answer instead of the truth, you're in a really dangerous place. You're in a dangerous place where you might miss what God is trying to say to you. Because what you're not trying to hear is what God is trying to say. You're trying to hear the thing that upsets our lives the least.
That's such a good word. And I'm curious how we protect against those motivated readings in our day. And I know you write about this a bit in the book for yourself, but it's certainly also going to be true for, especially I think for white Christians who right now are being rattled by, and like we're in a time of unrest and of questioning a lot, and we so humanly want a sense of security, and I already know what it's going to tell me, rather than again that kind of prophetic challenge that is all the same hopeful because it's the word of God. And if God is love and truth and justice and beauty, well, that's what I want, even if it disrupts my life. But at the same time, in my humanity, I'm also really inclined to just try to protect my status quo. So what do you think we can do to approach the text with that degree of like openness?
I'm not a deconstructionist in the sense that I think that the whole thing needs to burn down. I think it is very important for American Christians to kind of, especially white American Christians, to actually turn their gaze to other places. Because, and I talk about this in chapter 1, we can be lost in a binary between, if I start caring about these things, these other 5 or 6 theological things might change that are crucial to me. But if you look at like the global church and you say, well, look in places like Nigeria and Rwanda, where they do things like they talk about election corruption, and they talk about the Bible as God's word to us for our good, and they do community development, and they care about the environment. And that didn't cause the Nigerians to lose their faith. They could hold these things together. If you want a closer example, actually look to the Black church in America. And has a long history of advocacy for justice, along with remaining in the great tradition of things Christians have always believed. So it is not the case that if I start saying if I'm biblical, right? If I am, Jesus literally says, that he begins his first sermon with, the good news to the poor and the setting free of the people who are bound. And then after his resurrection, he gives the Great Commission and he says, go and teach everyone to obey all the things that I've taught you. So Jesus models in his ministry a concern for the weak and the marginalized. He preaches about it. And then he says to his disciples, well, go and tell everybody to do those things. And what we've done is think that Jesus says, go into the world and give everyone a plan of salvation. But that's not just what Jesus did. So what I'm saying is we think that if I only do part of what Jesus tells me to do, then that's going to keep me from losing that part. But maybe just doing that small part of what Jesus told you to do is distorting that too. Maybe that's the danger. We keep thinking that the danger is if I start to care about these things, it might cause division. But the church is already divided. Black people are already alienated. We're already saying, because you don't care about us, we can't be a part of the community. So the danger is already here. It's not that if I do this, bad things might happen. We're saying the bad things are already happening to us while so many people have a small understanding of the Christian faith that leads the concerns of the marginalized out. So what I'm saying is it's not the fact that you're safe now, that you're moving into danger. It's the fact that we're in danger now and we don't recognize it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think about, so there's this, what you've talked about in terms of like a motivated reading of scripture that can distort the gospel. But within that, this making the gospel too small. And I think that happens in a couple of different ways. One is just in the over individualizing it, right? So not saying that this isn't about personal sin and salvation, but just saying it's about so much more than that, because God is certainly about the creation of and the redemption of the whole of it. So us as peoples, as well as all of creation itself. But there's also, I think, you talked, I think already, there are these different ways in which the scriptures are applicable to all of us, right? So like we're all sinners. And you wrote in the book about how that was actually something that the slaveholders could agree with their slaves about, right? Like with enslaved people, yes, we're all sinners. Okay, so you stay in your place and I'll stay in mine was kind of the way to use that. And it just struck me that if they had at the same time been bringing up the end of Genesis 1, we're all sinners and we're all created in the image of God, and then bringing it forward to be a part of the body of Christ, I guess you can distort that to say, therefore you stay in your place. But I think that's part of that expansive vision. It's not just that we're all sinners, but we're also all these beloved creatures that God has good purposes for. And I was struck by, this is early on in the book, you wrote, I want to find out whether God saves me from my blackness or whether my blackness is a unique manifestation of the glory of God. Those are such different conceptions, right? Of who God is and what God is doing. And what would it mean for us to actually be able to celebrate the glory of God in our diversity, in our both our common humanity and our diverse cultures, experiences, gifts, and abilities?
This is where I push back as strong as I can against a colorblind model. And I know that in its like form, colorblindness means we just don't judge people on the basis of their skin color. But it's often used, it's weaponized to use, well, whenever a Black person or a person of another ethnic group starts talking about something, colorblind is used to like shut that conversation down. And the Bible, it just isn't colorblind in the sense of it doesn't think that ethnicity matters. And it's when I think about facts hiding in plain sight. He's called Abraham the father of many nations, many ethnic groups. So God is glorified in saying, look at all of the people who I could draw to myself and unite them under like the worship of me. And you have the exact same thing when you look at the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, that every tribe, tongue, and nation comes. And so if our ethnicity is eschatological, if we go into the new creation as Black and brown people and white people and all of these, we all come into the kingdom as our ethnic selves. And God is glorified in the salvation of each of us and each part of who we are. So it's not that like my Blackness is not immaterial to the story of my life. So the only way I could talk about what, like if there's a testimony time when we get to heaven, I can't tell the story of my life and what God has done in my life without talking about what it means to me to be Black and Christian. And the same thing as I would say for a woman, right? That like part of your Christian life is embodied. And so you can't tell the story of what it means to be a Christian other than talking about that. I would assume it'd be the same thing if someone is disabled. We can't erase these things right, from our story and then just talk about the Jesus part. They're part of how we walk through the world. And if I walk through the world as a Black person, then as a Christian, then my Blackness is the unique manifestation of God's glory, not in opposition. It doesn't make anybody else less. It just makes this is my story. And so, and it's the same thing if you're married, if you're single, like you either have to say, this is how I lived as a Christian, as a married person, and how I glorify God in my marriage. You can't tell my story without that. Or this is how I glorify God as a single person.
Mm-hmm.
Or this is how I glorify God as a single person for a season, or as a married person for a season. All of these things are inextricably bound up with what God is doing in the world. And God seems to want it to be that way. And that's because he seems to create us with these kinds of different experiences.
Yeah, I first started really getting my mind blown by this line of thinking when our daughter was born and diagnosed with Down syndrome, and just asking the question of like, will she have Down syndrome in heaven? Like, is this intrinsic to her identity, or is it this distorted, fallen piece of her? And I don't think I have all the answers there, but I did come to believe that who she is in this chromosomal difference that she has is actually a part of God's design. And that doesn't mean, again, that it plays itself out perfectly according to God's will or purposes. But at the same time, it really challenged me to understand the differences and diversities of our experiences as a part of what God uses, both to demonstrate our need and our gifts, and like how we need each other and can live in love with one another. And as you said, thinking about like John 9, the man born blind, and Jesus saying this didn't happen because of sin. It happened to glorify God. And I still don't fully understand how that all works, but I do have greater hope for that in all of our diversity than I probably did, 15 years ago before Penny was born.
I want to say this, like, I don't know about Christian eschatology in the sense of the question that you ask, but I can say this with confidence, that it's a part of her story and it's a part of your story.
Mm-hmm.
So like when she gets to heaven, or the new creation, is probably, Tom will make me say the new creation. When the new creation comes, she will tell the story of how she moved through the world and in whatever state she's resurrected.
Yeah.
She will tell the story of how she lived as a person with Down syndrome. And here's the problem. This doesn't mean that story is, the Bible talks on, you only get to eschatology. Every tear is wiped away from our eyes as we enter the kingdom. We weep one last time because the things that were done to us and the things that happened to us were actually harmful and hurtful. But after that, I think that pain becomes a testimony as we enter into the new creation. And so I am saying that I will tell the story of me and walking through this world as a Black Christian, because there's no other story for me to tell.
Right.
There's no colorblind story for me to tell.
And there is both beauty and sorrow in that story.
And there's beauty, there's tears, and there's joy.
Yeah.
And that's part of the mix of these things, right?
Right.
And exercise and hope. I mean, and exercise is interesting because you can just say it's something that we do. It's a practice. But anytime you have a practice, there's times where you don't want to do it. Like I didn't exercise this morning because yesterday was launch day and it was an emotionally taxing time. So I slept in. I should have gotten up and exercised, even though I didn't want to. Yeah. And so I think that's what it means to find hope, is to do it even when it's not easy, to continually work up the muscles and the cardiovascular strength of spiritual hopefulness, that it's a practice, which means it's not always easy.
Yeah, and not always what we feel like. I want to end with asking you one more question. Towards the end of Reading While Black, you write about how the Black Christian tradition's gift to the American church is to appropriate the Christian message as a power that can bring about personal and societal change. And I think one of the things I've observed as a Christian growing up much more in predominantly white churches is that I find either an emphasis on personal change, individual transformation that can be really freeing and beautiful, or an emphasis on societal change that does not address the personal, but that they have not been wed together. And that's something I really do want in my own life, is a continued emphasis on both personal and societal change and the power of the gospel in both of those areas. So I'd love to just ask you to end our time by thinking about this hope that an African American interpretive lens can offer and what the Black Christian tradition has to offer the church in general, especially when it comes to this question of exercising hope. And as we look at where we are right now.
One of the things that, if I could go back and rewrite the book, there's there's 3 or 4 quotes that I would put in that I took out, but they were saying I was getting a little quote heavy. And it's the story, and it's in a lot of ways, it's like emotionally problematic to read because it's the stories of the conversion of slaves. And you will see, like, the slave will say, well, I was in the field and then I had this knowledge that I'm a sinner and I need God's salvation. And it's really kind of strange to hear because, and then they said, and I was overjoyed as I went to the field the next day. And it's a really arresting thing to hear, to feel like, well, how can you call someone who's being sinned against a sinner? But that's not something that we're saying about them. It's how they describe their own life. Even in the context of slavery, they said there's something about me that God wants to do in me that he could do through the gospel. And so that testimony sits in the kind of the receive the positive African American spirituality, but at the same time, they knew that slavery wasn't God's will for them, and because they were experiencing both of these things together, it began to mark the African American Christian tradition. And for a variety of reasons, which we can't discuss at the end of the podcast, these two things are pulled apart uniquely in the United States, where there's the social gospel people over here and the transformational gospel over here. And so many of my white Christian friends can only see the world through this binary. And so the gift to the African American church offers to Christianity in the United States is to say that binary doesn't have to be there. Are there African American churches that have that binary? Yes, there are. There are African American churches that are social action with less transformation. There are pietistic Black churches that aren't socially engaged. But there's a huge swath of the tradition that combines both. And if people are saying, is it possible to do? I want to say it's not a hypothesis, it's there. And so I don't want to say this has to be very careful. I'm not saying that God caused Black people to experience these things so that they would construct this kind of theology so that American white Christians can learn from it. What I can say is that part of the glory of the story of the American of Christianity in America is what happened with the Black church. And because of that glory, people can learn from it if they're humble. One of the problems is we have to recognize, so I'll say this, and this will be like the good way to end it.
Okay.
If you're an African American Christian, you have already received, for the most part, a disillusionment with both the American church and the United States, and come to the other side of that disillusionment and learn what forgiveness and love looks like on the other side.
Yeah.
And so we've been through the trauma that many people who are in this moment going through. They're saying, oh man, I had this rosy-eyed picture of the church and I had this rosy-eyed picture of America, and it's more complicated. If I accept this more complicated understanding, can I still be a Christian in some sense? And the answer to the thing that's hopeful is we were never disillusioned. We've known for 200 or 400 years about this, and we've practiced the faith anyway. Right. And so if you're saying, is there a way to be a Christian on the other side of that, that doesn't just mean I either retreat to the social gospel binary or I retreat to the pietistic binary, is there a way forward that maintains kind of the historic things that the Christians have always believed? Then there's literally an example sitting right in front of our face, which is significant segments of the Black church. And the other thing is that if you go international, which the book doesn't do, you see the same thing in the rest of global Christianity. The truth of the falsehood of Christianity does not reside only in a portion of the North American experience, but in the global reality of who God is and what he's done in the world. And we have a local example of it here in the Black church in the United States.
Thank you for that encouragement. That's certainly what I want my own participation in that global reality to just increasingly understand, is how those two, what have been two very divorced aspects of an experience, I want them to be brought together to this sense of personal and social healing, transformation, and change.
The one thing that I want to say to people, and I want to make this clear, because people who aren't used to reading stuff like my book will hear it wrong. and they can read my book wrong if they say, well, the pietistic people are bad and the social gospel people are correct. That's not the thesis of the book.
Right.
The thesis of the book is you don't have to become less biblical to care about these things. You have to become more biblical. And so my goal is that people will return to the Bible more thoroughly, not less thoroughly, and with more confidence that the God that they meet there is a friend and not an enemy, rather than less. So I think that the combination of these things that you're concerned about is the only way that we can be Christian going forward. We are beyond the realm of being able to control kind of the flow of information so people know. And so I think that Christianity has to become more of what God actually intends it to be, because no lie can stand forever.
Well, that's a great way to end it. And I do appreciate your contribution to this conversation, not just in what we've literally just talked about, but in writing this book and in offering it as an exercise in hope and in faithfulness to this tradition, but also to not just the African-American Christian tradition, but to the theological tradition that spans back many generations and really gives a much richer portrait of who Jesus is, who God is, and why that's a compelling invitation for all of us to participate. So thank you for that. And we will make sure in the show notes that we've got links to your book and just information about how people can follow your writing and your career and all that you're doing. But yeah, I just want to say thank you for taking the time, especially after the busyness of yesterday, to speak with me this morning.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening today to Love is Stronger Than Fear. I'll make sure that all of our references get into the show notes, and I would recommend buying this book, Reading While Black. It was a great read and a great reference and resource for me, and I think it will be for you as well. And of course, if you're interested, share this episode, subscribe to this podcast, give it a quick rating or review so that even more people can benefit from these conversations. Thanks, as always, to our co-host, Breaking Ground. breakingground.us. You can find more podcasts, articles, videos that are reflecting from a Christian perspective on how to think about the past, how to understand the present, and how to explore redemptive possibilities for the future. Again, that's breakingground.us. Always, I am thankful to Jake Hansen for editing, to Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, and to you for listening. So as you go into your day today, I hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.